I already did, Barnes cut in. You have until sunset to leave New York. If I see you after 6, you'll wish that shooter had hit his mark. He stepped back, wipings, his hands on his jacket, as if he'd touched something filthy. The meeting is adjourned. The men left in silence, avoiding Harrison's gaze as he sat frozen, a statue of shame and terror. When the room emptied, only Barnes and Guy Fisher remained. Guy broke the silence. And the others? How do we know it was only him? Barnes walked back to the window, watching the tiny figure of Harrison running down the sidewalk below. We don't, he said without turning. But now they know. They know I know. And that I don't forgive. He touched the cut on his own face. The problem, Guy, isn't the traitor you catch. It's the doubt he leaves behind. Now, I look at each of you and see a potential Tony Harrison. He finally turned to Guy. His eyes were empty, burdened with deep exhaustion. And that is how any empire begins to fall. The sun that afternoon brought no warmth to Harlem. An invisible frost settled over Nicky Barnes' operations. Thomas Tony Harrison vanished before sunset, like a bad smell dissipating. His apartments, empty. His cars, repossessed. His accounts, zeroed out. Barnes was meticulous, thorough. It was a demonstration of power so absolute it left no room for doubt, but it also left no room for loyalty. In the days that followed, council meetings continued. Business went on. Heroin arrived, was cut, and sold. But something fundamental had changed. The silence. Before, the conference room buzzed with partners, debating prices, territories, sharing quiet laughs. Now, the silence was sharp. Men spoke only when asked. They offered facts, never opinions. They looked at Barnes not as a leader, but as an auditor. And they eyed each other with the quick, suspicious glances of prisoners in the same cell, each trying to guess who'd be next to fall. Barnes felt the shift. He cultivated it, thought it was renewed respect, useful fear. But fear, when breathed every day, becomes hatred. And hatred, when swallowed, becomes poison. A week later, Guy Fisher tried to talk to him. Bumpy, things are too tense. The men are scared. Good, Barnes replied, studying a report. Fear keeps people honest. Not this kind of fear, Guy insisted, daring to go further. This fear makes people look for exits. Barnes lifted his eyes from the paper. His gaze was pure ice. Are you looking for an exit, Guy? Fisher recoiled as if shocked. No, God, no. I'm speaking for the others. For us. Don't speak for anyone, Barnes cut in. Every man speaks for himself. That's the new rule. And that was the trap. The new rule isolated each of them. It turned collective trust into solitary cells of self-preservation. The Newark shipment incident was the perfect example. A valuable load was delayed. Before, any of the 6 would have acted, investigated, resolved it. Now, no one moved. Each waited for someone else to take the first step, afraid any initiative might look suspicious in Barnes's eyes. The shipment was seized. Loss, $200,000. At the post-disaster meeting, Barnes exploded. No one saw? No one knew? What do I pay you for, if not to manage business? Joseph Jazz Hayden, the oldest and most temperamental, couldn't take it. We manage, boss. But after what happened to Tony, a man thinks twice before even breathing. Do you want us to act or just obey? Because you can't have both. It was the first time anyone had openly challenged Barnes since the shooting. The air left the room. Barnes slowly walked up to Jazz. The two men locked eyes. I want loyalty, Barnes whispered. Unquestionable loyalty. Is that too much to ask? No, Jazz replied, jaw firm but eyes betraying fear. But loyalty doesn't come from fear, Bump. It comes from trust, and you showed us you don't trust any of us. That sentence hung in the air. It was the truth no one dared name. Barnes didn't respond. He just told Jazz to sit down. The meeting ended in dead silence. That night, for the first time in years, the 6 lieutenants met without Barnes, not at a club or restaurant, but in a dingy Queens bar where no one knew them. There was no conspiracy, no betrayal plotted, just exhausted men venting. He's getting paranoid, Wally Fisher said, swirling his whiskey. He's always been paranoid, Jazz grumbled. Now he's paranoid with reason, and we're the ones paying the price. What if he thinks one of us is the next Tony? Frankie James asked, voice trembling. Will he dismantle us over a hunch? Guy Fisher, who'd listened in silence, finally spoke. He won't, but he'll always suspect, and that shadow is worse than a gun pointed at you. It's a weed that never dies. They drank in silence, united by the solidarity of desperation. They weren't Harlem's lords anymore. They were 6 rich, terrified men trapped in a gilded cage one of them had built. Meanwhile, in his Central Park-facing apartment, Barnes stared out at the city. The cut on his face had faded into a faint purple line, visible only in certain light. He thought he'd cut out the cancer when he exiled Tony Harrison. But he didn't realize the real cancer wasn't a man. It was the climate betrayal created, and he'd institutionalized that climate. With his rules of silence, his suspicious gaze, His lesson that mistakes were punished with total annihilation. He'd taught them survival depended on never making a mistake, and the logical next step for a man afraid of mistakes is to build a safety net, something to protect him from his own boss. An idea began to sprout, slow and poisonous, in the minds of those 6 men. It wasn't yet a plan, not yet betrayal, just the instinct to survive. The same instinct that had driven Tony Harrison to hire a killer. Barnes, watching the city lights, felt a chill that didn't come from the window. He'd restored fear, but lost something he hadn't even known he needed to name: voluntary loyalty. And without it, a throne is just an expensive chair on a pile of sand. The wind of distrust began to blow, and it wouldn't take much to turn that sand into a desert in the years to come. Time passed. The scar on Nicky Barnes's face faded into a faint discoloration, noticeable only under certain light, but other scars, deeper ones, only grew. The council functioned. Harlem prospered, at least on the surface. Barnes was richer, more powerful, more untouchable than ever. The New York Times dubbed him Mr. Untouchable, and the legend stuck. He liked the name, thought it confirmed his ultimate victory. He didn't see the cracks, or if he did, he assumed they were part of the structure. The 6 lieutenants performed their duties flawlessly, never erred, never questioned. They were the most efficient corporate machine crime had ever seen. But the machine had no soul, no after-work beers, no confidences, no genuine laughter, just the silent hum of calculation and the bitter taste of swallowed fear. The wind of distrust, blowing for years, had dried any remaining roots of loyalty. Then a new wind began to blow, colder, more institutional. It didn't come from the streets. It came from a granite federal building downtown. Prosecutor Robert B. Fisk and Agent Richard Roberts weren't after one man. They were after a corporation. And they had the perfect tool, the RICO Act, designed to dismantle organizations brick by brick. They started with the weakest link. It always begins there. It wasn't a brutal interrogation. It was a conversation in a clean, well-lit office. They didn't threaten violence. They offered a contract. Frankie, James, the youngest, most nervous, was approached first. Fisk showed him photos. His wife leaving the supermarket, his kids at school. Mr. Barnes, Fisk said calmly, is a target, and anything near a target can catch a stray bullet, or a 30-year sentence. Frankie trembled. I don't know anything. We know you do, Roberts replied, sliding a stack of documents, liquidity fund bank statements, authorizations with his signature. You're a vice president. RICO treats all executives equally. Everyone is liable. Then Fisk placed a single sheet on the table, the cooperation agreement. Or you can help us reach the president and start a new life. Frankie looked at his children's photo, at the life sentence ahead, and remembered Barnes's icy stare in that room after the Tony Harrison incident. Remembered the constant fear, the paranoia. He wasn't choosing between loyalty and betrayal. He was choosing between fire and the fire escape. He signed. One by one, the federal wind blew. Guy Fisher resisted longest. He still felt a thread of old loyalty. But when Fisk showed him Barnes had a separate secret account, unknown even to the council, the thread snapped. Final proof. Barnes had never truly trusted them. Why should they trust him? Jazz, Wally, Ike, Hurricane. The process was the same. The fear Barnes had sown years earlier was fertile ground for the seed of the plea deal. The government didn't convince them to betray. It simply gave them a safe way to do what they'd already wanted. Escape that man's gaze forever. Barnes knew nothing until trial day. He entered the Manhattan courthouse in an impeccable suit, confident, smiled for reporters. Mr. Untouchable, untouchable. Then he saw his 6 lieutenants, sitting on the other side of the room beside the prosecutors. Not one looked at him. Prosecutor Fisk rose. We call our first witness, Mr. Joseph Jazz Hayden. It felt like the floor vanished. Barnes gripped the table. His lawyer whispered something, but the sound was muffled, distant. All he heard was his own war machine disassembling, piece by piece, in the voices of the men he'd built. Jazz spoke of meetings, codes, the liquidity fund. Tony Harrison, Frankie James detailed shipments. Guy Fisher explained the corporate structure with the clarity of a CEO briefing new shareholders. Barnes didn't hear the crimes. He heard the story of his own paranoia being weaponized against him. Every suspicious glance, every rule of silence, every exemplary punishment, now recounted to the jury as proof of a criminal enterprise. He'd handed them the operations manual. Now they were giving it to the government. The verdict was a formality. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: life without parole. When the judge's gavel fell, the sound echoed like a delayed gunshot. Not the Ford Galaxy shot in 1975, but the one Barnes never heard, though he'd loaded and primed it year after year with his distrust, his fear, his belief that power meant total control. As the bailiff led him away, Barnes looked one last time at the 6 men. They finally looked back. In their eyes, he saw no hatred, no triumph, only relief, the same relief as someone escaping a freefall. And then he understood. The true betrayal didn't begin with a check to a shooter. It began the day he stopped being a king and became a boss. The day he traded loyalty for obedience. The day he thought that would be enough. Years later, in his cell, Barnes would strike his own deal, turn informant, deliver dozens of names, including the 6, in a final bureaucratic vengeance. He'd die under a false name, a ghost. But that's another story. This story ends here, with the sound of a gavel, with the fall of a throne already rotten within, and with the hardest lesson the streets can teach. You can survive an enemy's bullet, but you'll never survive the fear of your own people. This is one of the stories of how Nicky Barnes, the Mr. Untouchable, hit rock bottom, not from a bullet, but from a gate signature. If this tale of power, paranoia, and consequences made you think, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Next time, the story of the man who beat Barnes at his own game, Frank Lucas, and the steel scaffold. Until then.